final type of risk is auditor business risk, which is somewhat similar in nature to client business risk in that it is the risk that the auditor's financial condition may deteriorate due to losses from litigation, from a decline in the auditor's reputation, or from the cost of an audit exceeding the fees earned on that audit. This risk must be assessed whenever the auditor is making a decision about whether to accept a new client or continue with an existing one. If the auditor decides that ABR can be reduced to an acceptable level through some combination of increased audit work, an acceptable fee level, and adequate liability insurance, then the client can be accepted or retained. But if ABR falls outside of a firm's risk tolerance guidelines, then it should be rejected. ABR is primarily a function of auditor business risk. ABR is primarily a function of audit risk. For if an auditor issues an inappropriate opinion on financial statements that contain a material misstatement, there is a much higher risk of the auditor being sued and of them suffering a hit to their reputation. Arthur Andersen is an outstanding example of this situation, as in the 10 years or so prior to their demise, they had been involved in a large number of audit failures, which resulted in many expensive lawsuits. And even before they were charged with obstruction of justice in the Enron case, many of their existing clients started leaving them for other firms. In addition, audits with higher audit risk also require more audit work, which increases the cost of the audit and heightens the risk the firm will lose money on the engagement. So there is a strong positive association between audit risk and ABR. As AR goes up or down, ABR goes up or down along with it. Client business risk can also have a direct impact on ABR, in addition to its indirect impact on audit risk via its effect on RMM and AR. The reason for this is that if a client with high CBR goes under, the auditor often gets sued, even in situations where the auditor issued the correct opinion on the client's financial statements. So the auditor has done nothing wrong. They've complied with all applicable professional standards. So even in a situation where audit risk is effectively zero and has no impact on the elevation of ABR, the auditor can suffer a loss due to litigation and a hit to its reputation. This kind of high-risk audit involving a going concern issue also requires a tremendous amount of audit work to reduce AR to a low level, thereby increasing the risk of suffering a loss due to audit costs exceeding audit fees. This final slide summarizes the relationships among the ARM and all the other risks I just reviewed, and also includes two other critical audit planning concepts that affect the ARM, namely materiality and audit approach. Together, this framework provides a snapshot of the key components of a thorough audit plan, and you should find it very helpful when preparing audit planning memos in this course and on professional exams. Before I get to the new concepts, I want to point out one risk relationship that I did not mention previously, and that's the one I have drawn in between FSLR and RMM. Most financial statement level risks will have some direct impact on multiple assertions, as I've already mentioned, and as I've drawn in here. But on occasion, there may be some financial statement level risks that can't be directly connected to any risks at the assertion level, but that have some general impact on the RMM of the audit. This dotted arrow represents this potential connection. Note that the dotted lines between BR, CBR, and FR also represent the possible relationships between these kinds of risks, as also noted in my detailed discussion of these risks a few slides ago. At the center of this framework is the standard audit risk model, AR equals RMM times DR, and its connection to the other risks of interest to the auditor. A new point that I want to highlight here is the effect that materiality has on RMM. Materiality has a direct impact on the risk of material misstatement, and the sign of this impact is negative, indicating that as materiality decreases, the risk of material misstatement increases, all else being equal. What this means is that if we set materiality at $100,000 for a client that has a set of risk factors we'll call A, then the risk of material misstatement for this client will be higher than if we set materiality at $200,000 for the same client with the same set of risk factors A. This is because even though the same set of risk factors exist in both situations, there is a higher likelihood of the client having just $100,000 in misstatements in their financial statements than there is of the client having over $200,000 in misstatements. That is, the materiality threshold is easier to breach when it's $100,000 versus $200,000, so the risk of material misstatement is higher in the former case. At this point, I also want to clear up a misconception that many students have, and that is that the relationship between these two factors goes the other way, from RMM to materiality. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. Materiality is determined based on the needs of the users of the financial statements and the decisions that they will make using the client's financial statements. It is not set based on the risk of material misstatement. In fact, it's logically impossible to determine the risk of material misstatement when you haven't even determined what materiality is yet, which is why Canadian auditing standards clearly state that a preliminary estimate of materiality must be made prior to performing the risk assessment, not after. So, always keep in mind that you should never justify a materiality level based on the risk of material misstatement, but instead only on the needs of the financial statement users, which is another reason it's so important to identify and discuss the financial statement users and their objectives at the very beginning of your audit planning memo. Materiality also has a direct and negative association with the audit approach, meaning that the lower the materiality level, the more rigorous the audit approach needs to be. I'll discuss this in more detail in a later tutorial, but an audit approach can be made more rigorous by doing such things as assigning more and or more experienced staff to the audit, bringing in specialists to do some of the audit work, gathering a higher quantity of evidence, and gathering higher quality evidence. In turn, the audit approach has a negative association with detection risk, so that as the approach gets more rigorous, the risk of not detecting a material misstatement goes down. Also, as the risk of material misstatement goes up, the audit approach must also get more rigorous, so that detection risk goes down enough to bring audit risk down to a level that the auditor can live with. So, just to quickly summarize the audit planning process, first, identify the financial statement users and their objectives and any conflicts among these objectives. Second, estimate materiality based on the needs of the users that you just analyzed. Third, perform a detailed risk assessment being sure to specify exactly which kinds of risks are being affected by each risk factor you identify. And then fourth, design an audit approach, including preliminary specification of key audit procedures needed to address high-risk assertions. In a client acceptance and client continuance situation, less emphasis would be placed on the materiality and audit approach components, but both of these areas should at least be discussed briefly so that their impact on ABR can be factored into the acceptance or continuance decision. So, I hope this overview of all of the risks of interest to the auditor and how they interact to affect audit planning decisions makes the process of audit planning a little clearer to you now than it was before. If anything remains unclear, please let me know.